So one of the things I want to make clear is the issues of how our changing world and the changing climate in our world is perceived now is one of, I think, the most tragic outcomes. The science about climate change has been well understood for decades, and there's been a growing consensus amongst scientists about the urgency and the causes of our changing climate on our Earth. And one of the things that I think is so tragic is that science has turned into something in our public conversations about this as if it was something that had to do with beliefs or something that has to do with our affiliations in groups, and that people align their views, and it has become a polarized political issue, as if one political group are naysayers and another political group are adherents to concerns about climate change. That is profoundly tragic, because it impedes our ability to address the most urgent issue facing our world. Actually, The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious journals, health journals, medical journals in the United Kingdom, says that climate change is the most significant public health issue of our century. It also says that it is one of the most significant public health opportunities, but we can only embrace that opportunity in our culture and in our society if we break down these divisions that align politically. And let me just say, impacts of climate change will affect the right and the left and Republicans and Democrats. None of us are going to escape the impact. So I think it's really important to think about this from the perspective of what's understood from the important work that scientists have brought to us, and then how to utilize that to make our world a better place, a more sustainable place for us and for the future. So if we move on to trying to think about how we've divided our world, we can step back and we can think the health impacts of our changing climate disruption are profound. And my particular expertise is in understanding some of the mental health impacts and the psychiatric impacts of climate-related impacts or experiences. And for the Central Valley, this inland empire, the San Joaquin Valley and Stanislaus County, I'm going to focus on a few things that I think are particularly pertinent here. Changing heat patterns are crucial for the valley. This is already an area where summer temperatures are very high, and the projections for changes of heat are quite amazing. There's the Union of Concerned Scientists has recently published a study that projects the kinds of increases that were expected both in the average temperature but in the frequency and intensity of heat waves. And for human beings, we only have a limited temperature zone that we can acclimate to. And that's really important for this Central Valley region. It is already very hot here in the summer. And the increases that are expected in the Central Valley are significant health impacts. And I'm going to leave aside the many medical non-psychiatric issues that have to do with cardiovascular illness and stroke and morbidity due to heat stroke. And I'm going to specifically focus in on the mental health impacts of extreme heat. Just as a side, there is projections of the increase, and there's been a projection that in the Central Valley there is in the range of a likelihood of a 6.5 degree increase in average temperature if we do nothing to curtail greenhouse gas emissions by 2100. That's big and makes the Central Valley feel like the desert areas in Arizona. So heat impacts have very, very specific impacts on behavior, on mood, on thinking, on the ability to sleep. We all know that when it's extremely hot and there's a heat wave, we all get cranky. We all, irritable. Our language expresses that by saying, I'm hot under the collar. I'm so angry my blood's gonna boil. Or our admonitions that say, hey, cool, keep cool. But there's actually scientific data, very well done studies that have looked at the increase in violence associated with increases in heats, and that's really important in the valley here. There is a 4% increase in interpersonal violence and a 14% increase in intergroup violence when there is an increase of 1 standard deviation over the baseline temperature in a community. That's big news for big impacts, big concern for how kids fight with each other, domestic violence, interpartner violence, impacts on women as victims of violence. That's very significant in groups, and actually during extreme heat there's more wars, there's more gang violence. This is known in the prisons, that the prison guards know when it's hot, things are going to get rough. So I think it's really important to know there's something about heat and extreme heat that triggers violent kinds of actions, and that has to feel angry is different than to act on anger. So people who already have marginal controls over being able to tolerate angry feelings without putting them into action are more likely to become violent or express that in a physical way. So I think that's one thing to be aware of. And this data that's been looked at is ubiquitous all over the world. And there's some ideas that those are connected to adrenaline and serotonin, some underlying biological possible mechanisms for that. There's another aspect of violence, suicide. Suicide is what I think of as violence turned inward. And we already know, there's an important study, and this needs to be looked at more, but that there are increases in suicide that happen with periods of extreme heat. And a very carefully done study by a researcher out of Stanford found that there's a 0.7 degree increase in suicide rates in the United States and a 2.1 increase in suicide rates in Mexico. And he just studied communities in the United States and Mexico. When there is an increase in temperatures. And he's projected in the range of 21,000 increases attributable to heat over baseline suicide rates by 2050. That wipes out all of the gains in suicide prevention programs, in gun control programs, and is in the range equivalent to the kinds of suicide peaks that we see during major economic depressions or those kinds of insults. Now, we've known for a long time that suicide is caused by many, many factors, and that there have been epidemics of suicide in Indian farmers during periods of harvest when their crops have not produced, and that's true in studies in Australia. But this report that just looked at the heat impacts and tried to adjust for other variables tells us it's much more complex than just the social reaction or the individual reaction to threatens to your livelihood. Further impacts of heat. Extreme heat makes it hard to think. Now, you know, I don't think so well when it's really hot out there. I can't, but we actually see decreased work performance. Students don't learn as well. Their capacity to produce well on exams goes down during heat waves. So our ability to think clearly is impacted. Insomnia. You don't sleep that well at night, and in the valley there will be more extended heat waves with day after day after day of high temperatures. Now, when the temperatures don't decrease at night, housing structures or cities don't have a way to cool down. And that builds the temperature day after day. It's something called the heat island effect. Our building, the concrete hold that. And we know that cities are much hotter than adjacent urban or rural areas where there are trees and ways to block the heat. Now, severe heat impacts the ability to sleep at night. And that's why we all want air conditioning when it's so hot. But not sleeping is a really, really difficult thing, and particularly if you're medically ill or if you have mood disorders. Those are profoundly affected by sleep irregularity. And we know, one of the things that we know for people who have bipolar disorder is we're always telling people, keep a normal sleep pattern. Insomnia can trigger instability of mood. So that's another important aspect of just heat as one of the factors. The Central Valley is also very prone to, historically in California, periods of drought, periods of flooding. And those will continue to be true, but climate change seems to intensify and lengthen the periods of both extremes of drought and flooding. And those have very specific kinds of implications for mental health. First off, droughts impact the ability for outdoor workers to work, and this is an agricultural valley. And the loss of productivity in the agricultural industry is significant. Not being able to derive an income has profound psychological impacts. It breaks up families. It causes people to move away. And we're developing a language around climate refugees. But particularly, if you are an agricultural worker, a seasonal worker who can't find work, your livelihood is threatened. And that has all sorts of residuals in terms of how you feel about yourself, the cohesiveness of your family, the need to move. Often there is a migration from these more rural areas to urban areas, but that creates a kind of influx of less skilled people. Jobs are scarce, and the cities are now having greater urban poverty. That has implications for social unrest, intergroup fighting, and political instability. I want to talk about one other aspect of the impact of the climate events that are really changing the landscape that we live in, the way we experience our connectedness to the land. There is a term, it's a fancy word called scolothalgia, but what we're seeing, and this I think directly impacts people who live in the valley or who travel and go close to the mountains, is that the areas that we've lived in and have developed a sense of home and solace are now damaged, and that our landscape is changing, and there's a kind of deep grief as we experience the loss of the land that we're connected to. So if you've lived in a rural area, or you've lived on a farm, and that area becomes depleted by the impacts of climate change, that area no longer gives you that same sense of being at home. Traveling into the mountains and seeing the scorched land from the death of the forests due to the beetle infestations that are connected to droughts, just as a deep pain that we experience in areas that have been so precious. And of course, that is much more significant for people who have lived close to the land and where attachment to the land is important. So those are just some of the ways that I think climate change has some impact on the communities in the Central Valley. Children are also really important to think about, because how children connect to the outdoor is really important. And during periods of these extreme air pollution, which is, the Central Valley is one of the most polluted areas in the country, we're now telling children they can't go out and play. And play has a huge important component to how children develop their social relationships, how they begin to form a sense of their own value. It enhances learning, and so having to curtail children's ability to be outside and freely playing has huge impacts on development. Go on.